This sounds like a pretty stupid example, but this is how totalitarianism works in practice. It's not often large campaigns like Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward, which killed anywhere between 20 and 100 million people, depending on how the estimates run. And nobody knows the real numbers because they lied and covered it all up. But this is how totalitarianism works. It asks you to do small things like respect people's pronouns or catch 10 flies. Now, I gave this silly example of 10 flies because that was actually a campaign that Mao Zedong put forth in China. It was one of the things Mao actually did with his people, is he had them catch 10 flies per day for the help of China, which was overrun with pests. He also had them chase birds at another point and killed off a lot of birds, and it led to a famine that killed millions of people because the birds were eating the bugs that were the next year. Because so many birds were killed, the bugs weren't there, the birds weren't there, so the bugs proliferated and they destroyed the crops, and some 2 or 3 million people starved. That was in the 1970s. You can look this up. This actually happened. So there was a campaign to catch flies. There was later a campaign to kill the non-native birds of China. These are the kinds of things these totalitarians do, partly because it builds commitment. But with the example of the flies, if Justin Trudeau came out and linked that to climate change, it creates an inextricable link in your mind that you have to do your part to fight climate change. And it's a stupid thing. So you're more and more committed, because why am I catching flies? Why am I going around looking for flies to catch? I don't see that many in my house. So now I'm out looking for flies so I can find 10 per day. I'm setting traps. I'm putting things out to draw flies to the house so I can catch them. Why am I doing this? Oh, yeah, because we have to stop climate change. And you become ideologically committed. In fact, Mao called this technique ideological remolding or ideological transformation. And it sometimes gets translated as thought reform or brainwashing. And these kinds of techniques are actually how totalitarianism is practiced. So if the government starts mandating that you respect the pronouns of people who demand that they have their pronouns respected, even though those pronouns are they're one of two things. One, they are out of step with reality if they don't match the person in their sex. Or two, they're superfluous. The number of people on the planet who would have to actually specify their pronouns as an adult for people to know which sex they are is a very small number. And that's unfortunate that they will deal with that, as it's called, misgendering sometimes in their lives. There are 0 people. Like if I went up to somebody and they said, "What are your pronouns?" I said, "Guess." I'm almost positive you'll get them right. They know what I am. They know what pronouns go with that. This isn't in question for such an overwhelming proportion of the population that one of two things is happening when you're being asked to participate in the pronoun game. Either you're being asked to affirm something false, or you're being asked to participate in something unnecessary. Both of these things are ultimately humiliating. The person that's forced to participate in this ritual is not being kind or empathetic. They're humiliating themselves. They're either lying and being compelled to lie and giving in to the lie in order to be nice. I think the colloquial term for lying to fit in is selling a piece of your soul. Or they are participating in a bogus ritual that everybody knows is bogus for some symbolic purpose. In both cases, you are actually humiliating the person involved. Now, if you read Theodore Dalrymple about communism, and he's a wonderful source to read about communism, he said that he finally realized after years and years and years of studying communist propaganda or totalist propaganda that its point isn't just to mislead. And in fact, its point is often not to mislead. It is to humiliate. It's to get people to participate in small lies and give pieces of themselves away over time so that they no longer have the ability to trust themselves to know what's true, that they no longer have the confidence to believe in themselves because they're constantly participating in these small lies. So to ask somebody to do the pronoun thing is almost no different, and in fact, in some ways, far more insidious than asking them to go catch 10 flies to stop climate change.
Wow, that's an amazing explanation with things like pronouns, flying a pride flag, whatever it is, taking the knee, all these sort of gestures that are increasingly demanded of us. So can we briefly link, so I think our viewers and listeners will be getting how that you're arguing that that's part of the totalitarian system. How does that lead to the billions? Because I imagine people just push back and say you probably this sounds like a conspiracy theory or something
Sure.
like that. So do you want to make that extra link?
Yeah,
for
so
us?
I'll talk about Mao, where we know that historically it is not in question that somewhere between 20 and 100 million people died in the Great Leap Forward. That's one specific period of time, by the way, that lasted about 3 years. And then I'll talk about what is happening here and why it poses a similar risk. So with Mao, I don't know why. All this study of communism, you think I would have figured this out by now. I don't know why, but they love 5-year plans. They always have 5-year plans. It's always a 5-year plan to do this, a 5-year plan to do that. So Mao took power. A lot of people don't know the history very well. He took power the first time in 1949, and he initiated his first 5-year plan. And it turns out Mao's first 5-year plan of building socialism was pretty successful. He got a lot of the backwards areas more organized. He got the ability to distribute resources. It wasn't pleasant. It was still a dictator that had just won a military coup and a lot of fractured, damaged population. But the first 5-year plan was actually fairly successful. And so coming into 1954 or thereabouts, he launches his second 5-year plan. And it turns out that that was aimed at increasing the efficiency and success of industrial production and food production in China, as well as deepening the commitment to socialism. And it was actually even more successful, it turns out. And he has these speeches he wrote in 57 and 58 bragging about how successfully it was going. And the history books actually show that and this is why communism is so popular at first in peasant societies very frequently, like Russian peasants took it up, being promised bread and land. And that's basically, I think it's probably rice and land, but that's more or less what they were promised in China as well. And it's very successful. And so we come to the end part roughly of Mao's second 5-year plan, and things have actually improved for the peasantry. I mean, it's not a good situation. Everybody's being brainwashed. There are purges going on. There is totalitarianism. It's not a great system, but economic conditions are actually improving in China for many of the people. So on paper, it looks fairly successful. So he launches his third 5-year plan, and he announces that he's going to do it in 57 and 58. We're going to have our third 5-year plan, and that's called the Great Leap Forward. And that's where Mao decided to get out ahead of his skis, because the thing is that communism ultimately doesn't work. It demands things of people that are not real, that they can't do. And then when it doesn't work, it externalizes the blame onto the people. Communism can't be wrong. It has to be that the people weren't sufficiently committed to it, or they had the wrong attitudes or the wrong values, or there were selfish people or spies or interlopers that were undermining it. And so the third 5-year plan, the Great Leap Forward, was to take China to the number one producer of steel and grain in the world. But he was so infused in his communist ideology at this point, and he had so few people disagreeing with him because of the previous thing that happened that was called the 100 Flowers campaign, where he purged the entire society of people who disagreed with him. He said, let 100 flowers bloom, let 100 schools of thought contend. So everybody has free speech. Tell us what's wrong with the government. And then about 9 months into this process, where people were telling them all the things that they didn't like about the totalitarian government, he started something he called the anti-right wing campaign, or the anti-rightist campaign. And he went after all the people who spoke up against the government and purged them, put them in prison, or killed them. And so as it turns out, he had nobody trying to reel him in anymore. And so now he started to say that the peasants, who are the farmers, have to learn to make steel so that everybody can go along. He started melting plows. He started melting farm equipment. Nobody knew how to make steel out in the countryside, so they were making pig iron that's worthless. Meanwhile, he had the people coming that actually were the steel workers and the army, and he had them going out and doing farming and bullying the local farmers to do land reform, and the whole thing just collapsed. And it turns out there was one bad winter involved. There was a bad winter that hit, but with the combination of the bad planning and the bad winter and being too out over his skis, the whole thing fell in the dump, and literally over 20 million, but probably 100 million people died, were killed, or were starved as a result of the collapse. The collapse in the Great Leap Forward was so bad that even though Mao was the dictator of a communist country, they made him step down in 1962. He regained power with the Cultural Revolution in 66. That's another story. So the reason that it led to hundreds of millions of deaths, or tens of millions of deaths at least, in Soviet Union and in China, also in Cambodia and so on, is because it doesn't work. And when it starts to fail, they blame the people that they call the enemies of the people. They blame their class enemies, and they start turning the people against, and the government and the people against their class enemies, and the mass murders, purges, a lot of forced labor that forces people to work until they die, all have to come into play to try to force this thing to work that's not going to work. So the unrealistic expectations and underlying ideology of communism eventually lead to force, and people die. What's going to happen here in the West is a little bit different. Two things are happening at once that threaten very large numbers of lives. We have advanced economies. I don't know if maybe you're an outdoorsy kind of guy. Maybe you know how to go out and catch a rabbit and skin it and cook it and eat it. Most people don't. Most people cut off from the supermarket and the grid are not going to make it very long. They don't have the capabilities. There are too many of us. If all of us knew how to go out and catch rabbits, we're going to run out of rabbits very quickly. Also, rabbits aren't sufficient to sustain us, as some people would understand. But the point stands. There are too many of us. We need advanced agriculture. We need advanced food distribution. We need water distribution. We have lots of things that we require to sustain the populations that we have. That's a big problem if you start, say, the diversity hiring problem. If you start creating an institutional pressure that pushes out people with the institutional knowledge to make those industries work, and start bringing in people for ideological reasons or for other reasons that aren't competent to do the work, or aren't interested in doing the work, or want to do activism or communism through their workplace instead of doing the job. The institutional knowledge collapse I'm hearing in multiple sectors: energy, farming, aviation, is a policing, military, is a looming crisis throughout the West, largely, but not entirely, based off of two forces. One of those forces is the DEI hiring. Another of those forces is, in fact, that the overwhelming majority of the potential talent pool, who would have been mechanics, machinists, electricians, and so on, tradesmen, went to college instead, and now they work in low-level management positions, pushing paper, and they have a college degree, so it's not like they're about to go become a welder. They're too good for it now. And so you have this bottoming out of the talent pool for the trades, but the trades are what actually makes society work. So that's one problem. When these grids or food systems or water systems collapse, people will die in large numbers. And you think, well, they won't want that to happen, but they actually, I don't know if they want the people to die, but they do want these collapses to happen, because the model that they're pushing in the West is called degrowth communism, or just degrowth. Look it up. The word's everywhere. Degrowth. The symbol for degrowth is literally a circle at the bottom of a well, of a drain. So it's your society going down the drain to what they call a circular economy in the middle, where they have all the parameters balanced perfectly, and all the inputs become outputs, and the outputs become the new inputs, and it's a perfectly waste-free economy. This is the vision. But the right name for degrowth is degrowth communism. You can read the books about it. For example, there's one that's very popular right now called Slow Down or Slowing Down by Kohei Saito, which is a kind of it's kind of a popular audience summary of his longer book, which is called Marx and the Anthropocene, toward an idea of degrowth communism, where they explain that what we need to do is to degrow Western economies. The Western economies are not sustainable, so we need to generate less energy. Well, we see that happening. They're turning off our power plants and replacing them with windmills that don't work when they freeze. We need to degrow our food supply. This is why the farmers are revolting across Europe. This isn't a huge, difficult question to answer. We need to degrow the amount of land that we use for economic production. This is the United Nations agenda that's called 30 by 30. 30% of the usable lands of the world have to be freed up by 2030. That made unproductive, brought back to nature. And so these are models that are designed around the idea of degrowth, which says that we're going to have greater abundance by degrowing and not focusing on GDP or quality of life as measures of economic success. They explicitly ask us to lower our expectations for quality of life for the cause, so that we can save the planet, or what they actually say is have greater abundance. Abundance of what? Abundance of free time, abundance of family, abundance of natural sunsets and natural environments that are nice to look at, abundance of, fish being fish in the ocean, not because we're overfishing them necessarily, but just for the fish being fish. And these things create a bigger picture of abundance than what is called commodity abundance. They say that capitalism produces a large amount of commodity abundance, but we forget all the other kinds of wealth and abundance that we could share in common through a commonwealth where we distribute the benefits of those things more fairly and equitably. And this is actually the model. Well, let me tell you a secret, and this is why billions are going to die. And it's very, very simple. There is no such thing as a society that has a high standard of living and low energy production. The overwhelming variable that determines quality of life, standard of living, ability to solve problems, ability to mitigate disasters or injuries when something happens, the overwhelming variable is capacity to produce energy. It's energy abundance. Energy abundance is wealth abundance. There is no such thing as a flourishing society that can't produce sufficient energy. Energy production, therefore, is a strong proxy for GDP. You can actually see this on virtually any chart that you look at about the two. And they want to cut those things back. They want to shrink GDP. They want to shrink energy production. They want to shrink food production. What are you going to eat? They tell you to get used to less. There actually are reports, for example, from an organization there in the UK called UK Fires, F-I-R-E-S, fires, like burning a fire, that's in collaboration with the British government, with Oxford, with Cambridge, with all the big universities. And they put in a document in 2019 called Absolute Zero, saying that net zero is not enough. We have to go to absolute zero. Absolute zero carbon emissions by 2050. What does absolute zero carbon emissions by 2050 look like? Well, it means no container shipping, no heavy rail, no cruise ships, no plane travel whatsoever. Everything is light rail, maximum. No new steel production anywhere. All steel is recycled. No new cement production anywhere in the world. This is the model that they're pushing. And what do they advise you to do, say, to stay warm in the winter? They say start buying heavier clothing and blankets now.